don't like that this is a fact of life. But if you are a psycho and you want to make headlines, you realize that our schools are soft targets.
Hi, I'm Ana Marie Cox. This is 90 Days with Ana Marie Cox. We are 59 days away from the 2024 presidential election. My guest today for this show, where we talk to smart people about this wild and historic election, we have history. He is Jamil Smith. He is the editor-in-chief of Emancipator. He is also my former colleague at the dear departed, late great MTV News. Man, we covered 2016 together.
I know. And it was weird to be at a convention without you. I will say that. It was weird to be at a convention without you. So I will miss that. But yeah, let's pour one out for the dearly departed MTV News newsroom and be thankful, honestly, for that time that we had.
I am genuinely, I talked about it on the show with Sam Sanders, which is that I got such an education out of working with all the amazing people we did there. Most diverse newsroom I've ever been in, youngest newsroom I've ever been in. Although that is said as someone who is now older than a lot of people entering the news business. So that's why it seemed so young, because I was starting to get old. So for me to have you on is kind of cheating because I like to just talk to you. But also we tend to talk about politics and we tend to talk about what's really going on, here. And today, what's happening, what's politics and what's hurting my heart, all the same, which is the shooting in Georgia. And
Yeah, it's brutal. And it's just the thing that strikes me about that off the top. The father buying him a gun. I'm a person who grew up with guns in the house. I grew up in Cleveland. And I had a father who was a veteran who knew how to use weapons, and we had them there for self-defense. But when I was the same age as that kid, my father took me out on a dry lake and it showed me how to properly use a weapon and how to not just use it, but to respect the power that it has. And I've never had to touch it again, really, not in any significant way. And to me, the infatuation, the way that we've had people integrate guns with their sense of masculinity, and their sense of manhood and their sense of being in this country is just obviously physically dangerous, but it's also spiritually and emotionally dangerous for not just human beings on an individual level, but also the American project as a whole. We just don't need this many guns. We just don't need them.
I mean, you mentioned the toxicity of combining your sense of masculinity with a deadly weapon. The kid was named Colt.
Yeah.
And
that struck me too.
That is a reference to horses. Like, I don't know. I want it to be, honestly. Like, we can kind of, it seems like a weird joke to make, but I hope that that's it. I hope that that's not how deeply ingrained, like, the fetishization of not just guns, but guns as a commodity, guns as a thing that you can own and show something of yourself, right? Like, it's almost like, it's also just sad to name your kid after a brand in general, right? Like,
well, yes. And also not the first time I've ever heard of that happening. But
right.
I think to me, what also strikes me is, it's guns as a method of communication. This is how I'm communicating my fears, my pain, my angst, my aggression, my evil. Who knows? Maybe somebody doesn't have a motivation. My mental health troubles are, and obviously we're not going to be Republicans here and complain the shootings purely upon mental health troubles. But if this is a way of people, how they've been taught to communicate, I'm not saying you have them escape blame for what they've done, but we have to look at all of the sort of unindicted co-conspirators here.
Yeah.
all the folks who enable this culture, who are not going to pay any price for the 4 lives that were extinguished
Yeah.
earlier this week.
I think I've been thinking a lot about the arrest of the father, and this idea that, well, he did name the kid Colt, he did buy the guy, buy the child a weapon, and the other reporting that's been coming out, all of which, I mean, I'm gonna cry on behalf of the shooter. Honestly, apparently his a lot of violence in the home. His mother struggled with addiction. One family member said he literally was asking for mental health help from people, like the kid was. Like, so
Yeah.
if they want to call this a mental health crisis in a way, they can, sure, but then do something about it. Like, what they do is call things a
Right.
mental health crisis and then don't, like, that's it, right? And
Hmm.
even I wanted to get this on the table because I think also it'll turn us to a larger problem and frame it for the election, which is the arrest of the father is another way of saying this is an individual problem. This is a problem
Yeah.
for individuals to take responsibility for, right? This wouldn't have happened if his dad had not bought him, right?
Plain and simple. Plain and simple. And especially for agnostics like myself, like the idea of thoughts and prayers after something like this. I know it's almost a well-worn trope to not just have people say thoughts and prayers after a shooting, but also for people to denigrate people saying that. But I think it's necessary that we keep doing that because frankly, um, thoughts and prayers aren't getting us any further. Thoughts and prayers are lazy. Um, it just is. And I say this as somebody who's 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 not just dealing with the political reality of this problem and what have you, but also as someone who's grieving
Right.
and who's learned, very acutely what are some of the helpful things to say, what some of the not so constructive things to say. And thoughts and prayers is just, it's the very, very, very least anybody can do. And we should be expecting more of our elected officials, certainly.
I agree, but I also add, as you know, I love hate the euphemism a person of faith. Like, I'm a Christian.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
I believe in God. I believe Jesus Christ is my savior. Uh, and I believe in thoughts and prayers. But what I think I think we both react to in that when I hear it said out of the mouths of politicians is it's another individual action.
Yeah.
Is not a communal action, because in its best, in the fullest expression of spirituality, not just religion, but the fullest expression of community, prayers and thoughts are communal, especially prayers, right? Prayers are
Yeah.
done with
Yeah.
other people. Prayers are only meaningful within a community. But when we say thoughts and prayers after a shooting, or when politicians say thoughts and prayers after a shooting, they're literally not acting in a community, right? Like, there is
Hmm.
a communal thing they could do. They are part of a specific group of people, as a matter of fact, that has the power
Yeah.
to do something. Like, thoughts and prayers feel powerful when you have no other kinds of power, right? And
Right.
I want to kind of get back to this idea of like arresting the father, and then the difference between like, I guess I'll pray for you, and let us come together, right? Let us
Hmm.
testify, right? That's another kind of way of like framing it in a spiritual, like, let us tell our stories about what has happened to us.
Yeah.
And those are the kinds of communal actions and communal responses that actually do help with grief, right? And turn grief into
Yeah.
something like action.
Yeah. But more broadly, I also look at this, when you talk about it from a political standpoint, we talk about the politicians who have enabled this culture and allowed it to sort of metastasize. Um, they've done so not for the benefit of those people. I feel, first of all, for the community, because they are subject to the homicidal whims of anybody, let alone this 14-year-old kid, but anybody. Georgia, like many states, including my home state of Ohio, is an open carry state. Um, It is a place that, where I have loved ones who I fear for because of the gun culture in that state. And it just doesn't have to be this way. And frankly, we have one side literally is, as Michelle Obama said, is telling us to do something. And the other side is saying, not only do we not need to do anything meaningful, but we should actually we should open the spigot further. We should make it, and to what end? That's my question for them, is to what end? Like, you're defending the Second Amendment. Like, it doesn't need defending. It's there. It's not going to be a problem. Like, it doesn't need defending. Okay. So that's not an excuse. So why then are you doing it? And unless they admit the reality of it, which is that they're doing it to help, feed a culture of victimization and violence, that actually helps them maintain their power base and grow that power base, then I'm not really interested in having conversations with folks who want to just act all high and mighty and holy when the occasion occurs, and also be reactionary to issues like this. It's way past time to be reactionary. Like, let's get going. And in other countries all over the world, I remember watching the Terminator Zero anime that's on Netflix right now. And one of the key points in that show is the fact that you can't, like the Terminator did in the first movie, go to a gun shop and just load up with all these weapons. And he's like, you can't buy a gun in Japan like that. And it actually figured into the plot. So that's, to me, I'm like, if even anime shows from Japan are making observations like this in subtle commentaries upon our gun culture, then I don't know what other alarm bells we need.
I mean, I want to maybe think of a couple of things, and how this issue wraps around to specifically the presidential campaign. One is Tim Walz having been a hunter, and the idea that you're open, sort of like you can own guns and have respect for guns and still be pro-gun control. I don't see a conflict there. I own guns, actually. There's a couple guns in my garage right now. I don't shoot them. I'm basically holding on to them for my dad, but they're there.
Yeah.
I know
I grew up with them.
I know how to get them out and clean them a little. I would not actually probably ever take them out except at a range. But and my father's actually explicitly told me, he was like, don't use these for home defense. He's like, if you're planning on using these for home defense, I don't want you to store them, because you're more likely to shoot someone you don't mean to shoot, or yourself, than you are to shoot an intruder.
Yeah.
My dad's a mathematician. I think I've shared that before. So
it's why after my mother passed, I didn't want to have, like, her partner was like, do you want to have her gun? And I said, I'm good.
I'm literally just holding on to it. But so I don't see the conflict for Tim Walz. And I also he has a story. This is maybe the more important part about what's happened for him, is he has a story he tells about why he went from the A rating with the NRA to the F rating with the NRA, which is that he was an avid hunter, still, I think, is a hunter. And then now, you know what's fucking sad? I can't remember which fucking school shooting changed his mind. I think it was the one in Florida. Keep this in, guys.
Like,
this is
again,
fucking
which
sad.
One?
Yeah.
Which
no,
one? Like, that's the thing.
David Hogg.
No,
maybe they should cut
Parkland.
this. Parkland. Yes, it was Parkland. Isn't this fucking sad? Like,
yeah, it is.
The way I got up this morning was an editor calling me to ask me if I wanted to keep a joke in a piece that I had written a week ago, making fun of gun culture. And I actually decided against it in that particular piece. It just felt a step too far. In general, however.
Well, honestly, here's the thing. I will say, to that point, though, gun culture is worth ridiculing. It's ridiculous. It is, and it meets the definition of the word. I'm not saying that we should make jokes about it, but ridiculing doesn't always necessarily have to be focused on humor. Like it's worth recognizing that it's ridiculous that when back to school season, like this is a conversation we've had in our newsroom. It's a conversation I've had in amongst my family members. Back to school season means, like what does that mean? For me, like we did tornado drills in Ohio growing up, right? I can't imagine having to like know all of the things that a kid has to know nowadays regarding just literally being able to survive. And
Yeah.
inherent in the debate, for instance, about cell phones in classrooms, right? We have to consider that, hey, maybe a kid should not put a cell phone in a pouch during class. Maybe a kid should make sure they have access to that phone in case one of their classmates or some other person comes storming in with a submachine gun. What
Either
in
in
the
case they
world
need
are
to call
people?
911, or in what happened, a thing that happened in Georgia is that a 16-year-old girl texted her mom, "I'm sorry I haven't been a perfect daughter. I love you."
Oh, oh, and that's just not something that, I mean, here's another sort of theory behind this is that this is a part of a larger erosion. I think that's that on the behalf of the right that they're attempting with regards to education. If you make the place where you get that education an unsafe space, what then? Are you hoping that people start homeschooling their kids? And if so, what kind of effects does that have on their education? I ultimately think, listen, I mean, I think ultimately the right would love to have a populace that's as ignorant as their candidate. Um, I genuinely think that. I mean, if
Yes,
you
I
saw
agree.
last night just with Reshma Soujani's question in New York to him about childcare, he has no idea what he's talking about. He has no idea what his policies are. Or to the extent that he does, it's based purely within the cruelty matrix that he and his acolytes have continued to promote. I definitely don't think that he's somebody who's we could get so tied up in whether or not he believes these things. To me, it's about, hey, an uneducated populace works for the Republican Party.
Yeah.
The less educated our populace is about everything, let alone our history or things that are inconvenient to their narrative about America. Those things are helpful to them in terms of maintaining power, and not just for white people but for the oligarchy more broadly. And I don't mean to get too woo woo about it, but
Um,
really we have to see school shootings as a way of or enabling these school shootings as a way of helping to continually erode the educational structure of this country, at
oh, I
least within
agree.
public education and private. Yeah.
I agree, and I also think that it's not woo woo at all to say that this is just part of the larger project of atomizing our community, of decommunifying it, and turning us into a nation of individuals rather than a community, right? And also doing whatever it can to keep us from connecting, and to make us as internalize as much as possible that we are responsible for our own care, our own education, our own housing, our own healthcare. Like everything is something that we have to do for ourselves, and we cannot rely on anyone else to do it for us. And that, if you look at Republicans' policy through that lens, you can see it echoed over and over again. That they want you to not trust anyone, to not trust that you will be taken care of in any way, and that
Mhm.
creates friction between ethnic identities, that creates friction between genders, that creates friction between age groups, like that creates distrust that enables people with money and power to continue to have money and power. I think something like
Yeah.
arresting the father sends this message of like, yeah, you have to take care of that. You have to take care of that in your own family. This the panic over trans children is another one that they say it's that we're concerned the school's going to come in and trans your kids, but really it's an attack on the safe space of a school. And it's
Hmm.
actually, in a weird way, not in a weird way, sorry, it is directly an attack on giving children a loving community in general, right? And trusting
Yeah.
a community to
Or,
be able
or,
to
or,
take care of a kid.
or feeling like, I mean, well, I mean, to me, I think that, like, someone who has written a lot about identity throughout my career, what I've seen is that sometimes our identities are inconvenient to certain narratives. Just literally our actual existence is whatever ways that we identify and are identified are inconvenient to people like Donald Trump and the Republicans, because they would rather have us think that we all need to be a certain way and just kind of like put our identities in a box, rather than actually learning about and having to create policy that helps us all not only embrace one another's identities, but helps eliminate whatever inequity gaps that do exist. And I mean, it just gets back to the lazy thing that I said earlier. I mean, these folks would rather create division, have us all be lone wolves, pardon the pun, and have all, just be all separate from one another and be suspicious of one another, because that helps them maintain power.
Mhm.
And if that, that's a lot easier, that's a lot simpler than actually figuring out ways to govern a multicultural and diverse society.
Yeah.
And also, when your policies are ultimately aimed at serving the oligarchs amongst us, and making things actually more difficult for the very people who are voting for you, you can't tell them that
Yeah.
and expect that you can remain in power.
Yeah, I just think that I figured out like a good hack for myself whenever I'm thinking about analyzing the GOP position on anything, which is like, how does it separate us? Like what is the
Yeah.
method by which they're trying to separate people from each other and separate people from care? And that works on thinking about healthcare policy. That works in thinking about like job protection policy. That works that gun policy. Like there is basically that is the entire aim of the party that represents the oligarchs, the party that represents white supremacy more than the other party, let's say. Um,
Hmm.
uh, all of it is about separation. And this sort of wraps back. I wanted to see if you're thinking about anything else about the election, but this sort of wraps back to this thoughts and prayers thing and the idea of
All the things.
the idea that the hopeful way, the way that I, as a person who does pray, would want thoughts and prayers to what I would want that to communicate is let us come together, right? To me, that's what thoughts
Mm.
and prayers should mean is let us come together and console each other. Let us come together and plan. Let us come together and hear each other's stories so we know what to do next. Let us come together for a moment and then take action, right? But
Hmm.
instead, it's used in the service of separation. You have to take care of this yourself. You, as a father, are individually responsible for taking care of, like whether or not your son gets it done. Like you, as a child, that's really the thing that makes me like tear up about this kid. You, as a
The child.
child, are responsible for somehow figuring out how to get your own mental health care. Like,
Well, that's the thing. It's like, instead of thoughts and prayers, it probably should be thoughts and therapy. But therapy actually requires work,
yeah.
and that's not something that these folks are interested in doing. They're not
Mhm.
interested in working towards a solution. They're not interested in actually solving this problem, or else they would have, because other countries have done it.
Yeah.
But they don't want to. They don't want to. It's like hey, like, uh, listen, you don't get to play with the. They're not toys. They're but I do think that, like, to some degree, Republicans treat them as if they're being asked to give up their toys so that everyone else will benefit. And I'm driving anyone who drives through most of the South. I remember being in Florida, seeing billboards, gun shows advertised like you would think the carnival was coming in town.
Yeah.
And it's not a form of entertainment. It's not a form of it's not a leisure activity. It's something that's quite lethal, and we need to. I don't, frankly, listen. I mean, everyone points to Sandy Hook as like the moment where we kind of, crossed the Rubicon with regards to gun violence, and we just, became a society that accepted this. I don't think people are accepting this at all. I think people are. I don't think people are accepting going back to trans rights. I mean, I don't think people are accepting discrimination at all. I think most of the people don't like this. We're dealing with a minority party here,
Yeah.
right? They may not be a minority in terms of the people whom they seek to represent, but they are a minority party, the Republicans. And, that's, you have on the other ticket, you have, you have people who have supported trans. I mean, trans people are arguably the most vulnerable, targeted, powerless group in this country. And you have now at least a vice presidential candidate who has signed, executive orders seeking to protect these folks and seeking to protect others who are marginalized because of their identity. And we're talking about people. Who are you? Who are you? And if your identity can be wrapped up in guns, but it can't be gender fluid.
Right.
Okay.
You said something I really want to dive into. I want to just nail down, which is there is a trope in punditry about the C moments, the C change moments in our dialogue about guns. Oh, Sandy Hook was, we decided, one story we tell is we decided to get together as a country after Sandy Hook, and we couldn't get anything done. I guess where is our will? And then there is, Parkland, also the fucking thing the story that Tim Walz tells. And again, not saying the story isn't true, but it's a story that he tells. But then there was Columbine, the one that you and I remember are old enough to be like, that was a moment that everything was going to change. But the trope and the cynical story that gets told, even on the left, is, well, I guess we don't have the political will to do this, right? I guess America never will change. There's even that famous Onion article is like, whatever, nation mourns, how could it happen here, in place that it happens all the time, right?
All the time.
What I want to highlight, billboard, shout, is to echo what you said, is that actually we do have that like will in the sense that people want it. It's been a majority position for decades, more like better, more gun control, smart gun control, whatever, gun control reform, however you want to put it. The American people have been in favor of it and also been in favor of abortion rights for decades and decades and decades. Like when we talk about, oh, the Americans don't really want this, or we talk about the lack of political will to make these kinds of changes.
Right.
We're talking about a minority power representing a minority of Americans who talk about it as though they're half the country, who talk about it as though it's just like, oh, I guess Americans that's a radical idea. And so Americans are against it. That's just not the case. The problem here is that we exist in a country where democracy has been eroded to the point that we're just used to it being not very democratic.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, to me, if I may jump in, I mean, it's a larger question that revolves around what is an American, what is the American identity, and I think that if you have folks who insist that we must have guns, we must have various different that ultimately are destructive to us, but that make us American, then we need to be questioning what the American identity is and how we can change that. And what needs adjustment. We don't need to follow some sort of Hollywood legend about Western, stuff that you see in Westerns, and it's like that kind of stuff feeding our sense of masculinity and heroism. But ultimately, I think that really the last thing I just mentioned is this part of the problem. We always need to be the hero of our own story in this country. And the problem with that is that we can't think critically about not just what we have done and collectively as a country, but also what we are doing to each other. And we cannot think critically if we're sitting here thinking that, okay, America is the greatest and that's it. America can be the greatest on a number of levels. That's fine. You can talk as Kamala Harris did in her acceptance speech at the convention about um, accepting the awesome responsibility of being an American. But that's a responsibility that comes with work. That's not something that you can just throw on a t-shirt and walk out of the house and think like, okay, I'm good. I've represented myself as an American. Or you can wave a flag or sing a song and, kind of do all this sort of jingoistic stuff that people do, thinking that, like, okay, I fulfilled I'm being a patriot. I'm fulfilled my patriotic duty. Um, I'm not saying that you have to go and serve in the armed forces. I'm not saying that you have to go run for office. I'm not saying that you have to do things that are beyond maybe your capacity. But there are ways that we can be thinking critically about what it means to be an American. And we should be doing that in moments like this. What does it mean to be an American in a country, in an America that allows this kind of thing to continue to happen? And as far as political will goes, that's nonsense.
Yeah.
It's about folks who don't want this to change, period. They don't want it to change.
So you and I have been friends for a long time, and also you and I have talked to each other through various personal journeys, including mental
Yes.
health struggles. And so I'm really finding myself reacting to the idea of the idea of thinking critically and the importance of it. And I hear that and I hear what you're saying, but also something that I've had to learn at this late age is that thinking is not always the answer. That
Mhm.
feeling something, really being present, is often the first step before
Yeah.
thinking and taking in information. You can tell yourself, no, what I'm doing is thinking. What I'm doing here is
Mhm.
solving the problem. But I think there's a metaphor to the country here, which is like not slowing down and feeling, right? Not fully taking
Right.
in the information of what is happening. And instead relying on like past stories of masculinity, stories of individual heroism, stories of independence,
Mhm.
and the stories we tell each other about what an abortion is or what an abortion isn't, right? What a trans person looks like or what they don't look like. Instead of taking in information and letting it sit,
Mhm.
whether it's the grief of the families and the loved ones in Georgia, whether it's the fact that infant mortality in Texas went up by 12% here and post-ops. Like, you don't need to think about that. Actually, don't think about that. Don't think about that number. I would encourage you to not think
Yeah.
about it. I would encourage you to feel it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That felt like a punch in the gut just now, hearing that. And yeah, I think about that concept a lot because of how I've been grieving. As many people know, I lost my mother last year, and trying to avoid the grief or trying to distract myself from it, not nearly as constructive as letting myself just sit and feel it. I've taken days off where I said, to myself, I'm not going to be productive today. Um, I need to just sit down and cry, or I need to take a walk, or I need to do something that she would have loved, or I would have listened to a song that she enjoyed. Um, it's changed who I am, and you can't undergo that kind of metamorphosis without making sure you're taking account of yourself and what you're doing and how you're doing it. And that can be applied on an individual level and a collective level. Um, we can't just sit here and be like, okay, yeah, I'm going to go to this seminar, or I'm going to go to therapy, or I'm going to go to this class and I'm going to be changed. Um, you have to do some sitting and thinking about it afterwards. You can't just do the exercise and not think about the recovery and the nutrition. you know, to me, sitting with it, feeling it is part of not just the recovery, but also the nutrition that you need.
It's come up a lot on this show, the importance of the work after a campaign and after a vote, and how you may win an election, but that doesn't mean the campaign is over. And I'm thinking about that right now with sort of the metaphors we're using about, like, if you're training for a race, or if you're you don't just stop after the race, right? Like, ideally, like, you keep training for maybe a longer race. Like, you keep you keep going, and you try to do something harder. And right now, it's hard to think of it in this America. The idea of electing a Black woman to president seems like the hardest, longest race that you could possibly run, right? But actually, what
Right.
that suggests is that we should be ready for them to do something even harder afterwards, right?
That's the thing. I think, yeah, I think we have here in this race, we have a candidate that represents a possibility of America just inherently within her identity, let alone her policies or her own personal story. Within her identity alone, there's a representation of the possibility of America. But then, of course, that not being the possibility for America that other people might not want, you have a candidate on the other side who is not just uh, opposing those possibilities or those possibilities manifesting. He is standing in direct opposition to any sort of form of progress. He doesn't. He wants us to not be satisfied with where we are, but actually go back to something we were. And that implies, of course, that America hasn't gotten any better. And that's why I feel like he's consistently is talking about how horrible everything is. And not just because Biden's in office. He's talking about how horrible everything is in America because he wants people to long for some sort of halcyon days, way back when everything apparently was great. But, I guess for the people that he cares about. Not, I would say, like, I always thought about this because Back to the Future was one of my favorite movies as a kid. And it's like, if I had gotten in a DeLorean and gone back to 1955, how different would that movie be?
Oh my God. Someone should do, like, racially flipped, like, Back to the Future. Like, that the guy
Yeah.
that made Sorry for Bothering You, he should do that movie.
Oh,
Like,
yeah. Oh,
that
Boots Riley.
yeah, Boots Riley.
Sorry to bother you, by the way, is a
Oh.
modern classic. And
Oh,
Boots
it is so
Riley doing
good.
that movie would be absolutely gonzo. But to me, I thought about that even as a kid, and I'm thinking, like, 1955 is the year Emmett Till was murdered.
Uh-huh.
We're sitting here like we're worried about whether that George McFly is gonna, like,
Yeah.
kiss Lorraine on the dance floor, and meanwhile, like,
Well,
Emmett Till
and
was
Chuck
killed like a
Berry's
couple months before that.
and Chuck Berry's, like, brother or cousin,
His
or
cousin,
cousin, but
Marvin
Chuck
Berry.
Berry is dealing with a lot, like, like, Black musicians in the South, kind of weird. Black musicians in the South that have a lot more to worry about than inventing rock and roll, right? And also the idea that you would then credit a white man
Or where
for
to hide the
inventing-
DeLorean.
Yeah, and also that means that a white guy invented black rock and roll. Anyway, I actually want to get back to the
Oh no!
feeling.
Oh, I've tumbled down that rabbit hole. Believe me.
Okay, all right. I want to get back to the feeling and taking in and pausing and allowing time for space, time for grief, and time for
Yep.
recovery, because this podcast started in part because we were going to do something else, and maybe we still will. My producer and I, in a different show, we kept on getting on calls and talking about, it was right, Biden had left, and Harris was going to be atop a ticket, and everything was suddenly very exciting, and we couldn't stop talking about it. So we'll do a show where we talk about the stuff that's happening. This is that show.
Yeah.
But, and maybe this is just like, the depressive in me, I keep on wanting to pause and say what I'm about to say, which is, let's remember how hard this is. Like, it feels so good to have someone to get excited about at the top of the ticket. And also, I'm particularly excited about Tim Walz. And it feels so good to have this sense of, like, yeah, this could happen. We could really do this. But as anyone who's trained for anything, and actually I would put both athletics in here, or a writing project, or a grieving process. Anyone who's gone through anything that's really long and hard knows there are good days and there are bad days. And that you will have, no matter how good a day or how many good days you've had in a row, they're not going to last forever. And that's okay. That is okay.
Yeah, and it's okay to sit with your feelings. It's okay to feel depressed. It's okay to want to curl up on the couch and watch a marathon of Netflix documentaries. Like whatever you feel like you need to do at times, especially in times of deep, deep personal grief and stress. We need to be okay with that as a society. But unfortunately, I feel like to some degree, a lot of the thing I definitely kind of came up against after my mother died was a realization that this society, despite death and grief being universal human experiences, nearly universal, right? We don't have nearly the kind of infrastructure we need to deal with it. We don't have the kind of infrastructure that we need in order to help people I was an only child, making decisions the day after my mother passed about financial stuff, about this and that, all these different things. There should be someone to help us. There should be an infrastructure to help people. There are decisions I made that I definitely would not have made if I had my right mind, if I was, and frankly, if I'd just been left to grieve, if I'd just been left to do that, doing that was enough. Doing that should have been plenty. But instead I had to worry about, okay, am I going to eventually have to take a week off of work? Am I going to have to do all of these, things with regards to accounts? Where are,
Yeah.
It's too much. It's simply too much. And making, broadening that to, on a national scale, we grieve all the time with regards to things that are happening in the world. We are grieving for the hostages, that are being held by Hamas, as well as what Israel is doing with its retaliatory violence. We are grieving what's happening in the Congo and all over the world with regards to civil wars and colonization and all of these different horrible things that are happening. We grieve for our planet, which is making itself increasingly inhabitable for us largely because of things that we have done to it. That's a lot to process. It's too much to process, but we need to make sure that we compartmentalize our day in our lives so that we can process these feelings the best that we can. But unfortunately, I think capitalism doesn't allow for that. You only get so many days off. You got to get back to work. Got to be expected not just to get back to work, but to be productive in the same way that you were before. I know that I've had a lot of trouble with that, and I have found a number of people who seem to relate to that experience. And I don't have the answers as far as what to do to solve that, but I do want to make sure that we make that a national priority. It should actually be a policy priority.
Yeah, I mean, and something that Democrats have talked about is like the loneliness epidemic of the country, which I think gets back to this idea of like, do we solve our problems collectively or individually? And
Right.
the way that I think the way forward politically and policy wise, dealing with our loneliness epidemic is also dealing with our gun violence epidemic. Dealing with our loneliness epidemic is also dealing with our general healthcare crisis. Dealing with our loneliness epidemic is dealing with our aging crisis, right? Like it is all about connections and community, and the connections in a community can allow people the space to grieve on their own time. Not their own time, but like if you have that connective tissue, someone gets to tap out, right?
Right.
And gets to come back in when they've had rested their knee, right? I think of my vision of a great communal society is, that game when you're a kid, like you're holding hands and you run and you stop and like you fling the other person forward, right? You know that momentum
Ah,
game? You never played that?
no, that's a new one for me. I don't think I
So
played
like
that one.
you run, and then if you stop and like other people get flung forward and then they stop, then you get flung forward. It's a game of like playing with momentum,
Oh,
you
I
know?
remember that now. I remember that
Yeah.
now. Yeah, yeah,
To me, that's a great metaphor for how society kind of is supposed to work. Like when you stop, like someone else, can pull, like someone else runs forward and then they need to stop and you can run forward. It's like this, like it's a wave, right? Where some people get to stop every
yeah,
once in a while and other people are running and they carry it forward. There's probably a less elaborate metaphor
yeah.
than that, but that's the one I always think of.
No,
But then
but I think
you
what you're
allow
speaking
us to
to.
speak. Go ahead.
Oh no, what I think what you're speaking to me is, is we I think collectivism within society has been given a bad name because I guess people, still hung up on. That's why he's trying to call Kamala Harris comrade, associating her with communism.
Yeah.
But collectivism, that's literally just us as neighbors being concerned about the welfare of one another and working together to create a healthier and better society. Um, Not just looking out for self,
Yeah.
which I think, maybe all Donald Trump knows how to do, but his personal foibles aside, like they're pushing, they found an opening within our society, a weakness. I always say that, Donald Trump like knows where the holes in the boat are. There's a lot of holes in the American boat, right? There's little things that'll cause this American project to sink. He knows where the holes are and he's seeking to widen them instead of plug them. And they're benefiting from a society that becomes more individualistic, more selfish, and less collectivist. And I'm not saying you got to be a communist. You can still be a capitalist and still be a collectivist. You can be thinking about mutual benefit, thinking about ways that our policies and our culture benefits everyone else and takes
Yeah.
care of everyone else. I mean, perfect example, right? We go to policy for a second. Tariffs, right? Both have come out for tariffs, but it's been shown that Donald Trump's tariffs would actually hurt the people who are voting for him. The most of the people who are voting for him are in states that benefit more from the taxes that we pay here in the blue states. They're benefiting more from that than vice versa. And what he would be doing is basically imposing a tax upon consumers, a very quite severe tax that people already cannot afford. They can barely afford groceries in a lot of places right now. They cannot afford to have additional taxes paid on that in lieu of course, a tax on millionaires and billionaires
Mm-hmm.
that would not only solve the kinds of issues that the tariff tax on consumers would address, but actually probably do it more efficiently and for a longer time. But he can't propose that because he doesn't work for consumers. He doesn't work for the regular American who is struggling to pay their rent or has student loan debt or all these different things that we're saddled with in order to get to a point in society where we're told we can succeed. We're told that we need to have a certain kind of house. We're told we need to have a certain kind of education, and all these things cost money that we don't have. And then when we get into debt trying to get these things, then we're told that
It was your fault if it didn't work. You played the game. You played the game and you lost. That's not that the game is rigged. It's you played and you lost.
Right.
And because, well, I could probably go on this whole like this communication and collective like just sitting with what's happening rather than like trying to create a story about it. Because that's what I'm working on in therapy right now. But
Mm-hmm.
rather than do that, I'm just going to ask you if you have any final thoughts.
Gosh, so many. One is, I wrote right before the convention about why I don't feel like I can join in with all the joy and the optimism and hope that is being projected out of the Harris campaign. I don't begrudge folks for feeling that way. I don't certainly challenge that approach politically. I think it's actually been quite ingenious. But I vote on defense. I vote
Mm.
defensively. This is just something that I've always done. And I think back to the first time I think about these young people today, and they're about to cast their first vote for president. And a lot of them are going to cast that vote for a black woman, a woman of also South Asian descent. I mean, there's just so many differences between that and what I was forced to do, which was to cast a vote to reelect Bill Clinton 2 years after the '94 crime bill. Um, I vote defensively because I simply I look at the alternatives, what's actually going to damage people's lives, um what's going to make people's lives worse if we don't do something, as opposed to what is going to make people's lives better if we do this other thing. And lastly, as Kiese Layman told me, it's a terrible job. Presidency is a terrible job on a lot of levels. There are people who are going to die because of the decisions that you make as a president. That's true pretty much for everyone who's been in that office. There are people who are going to suffer. There are people who, if you fail, are going to suffer disproportionately. COVID, Trump. But I do think that it's worth considering if people out there are struggling with like, hey, I just can't support this ticket because of the administration's policies on Israel. I can't support this ticket because I just don't believe that a president can do anything for me to change my life in a significant way. I would ask that person to understand that voting is not about you. It's not about what it does for you. It's about what it does potentially for everyone around you. And that the vote can be a gateway for folks who are looking to kind of get it out of that individualist thinking and into a more collectivist mindset. Ending racism helps everybody. Ending misogyny helps everybody. It doesn't just help the victims of those particular biases and discriminations. It helps everyone. And the sooner we all realize that, the sooner we all internalize that and actually take actions that reflect that, the better off we're going to be.
Jamil, thank you for stopping by.
Appreciate you having me. Good to see you, my friend.
Jamil Smith is the editor-in-chief of the Emancipator, an anti-racist publication building off of the historical Emancipator publication, which was the first abolitionist
newspaper. Yes. And of course, we also have a newsletter, of course, called Critical Thinking, written by yours truly. And we hope that everybody signs up.
Oh, so you're doing like a low-key, like subliminal ad every time you're talking about thinking critically. Like you're like, this is my newsletter. This is my newsletter.
I always say I'm an evangelist for critical thinking, and it's just the title we settled upon. So I was doing that even before there was a newsletter.
I want to be an evangelist for you. So you, Jamil Smith, are awesome, and your newsletter is worth subscribing to for sure. Everyone, this has been 90 Days with Ana Marie Cox. We have 59 days until the election. This is available for people who are watching. Should know that you can get it as a podcast. People who are listening to it should know that it's available on YouTube, www.com. That's not how you say that at all. It's youtube.com/@90 Days with Ana Marie Cox. And we'll be back next week. Rate and review the show. Tell your friends and neighbors. Comment, like, subscribe, all the different icons that you might see on this screen or below it.